Brightvale was a town like many others, nestled in the heartland with its quiet streets and hard-working people. But beneath its tranquil surface simmered a fear no one dared to name aloud: the Iron Talons. For years, the ruthless biker gang, led by the cunning and merciless Roy Blackstone, held the town in an unrelenting grip of terror. Extortion, violence, and intimidation were their currency, and Brightvale was bleeding dry. At the center of this storm stood Henry Fields, a humble farmer whose quiet demeanor and weathered hands gave no hint of the extraordinary past he had buried. But when the Iron Talons pushed too far, and the safety of his town came under threat, Henry found himself drawn back into a world of strategy and resolve he had long left behind. What began as a desperate stand to protect his home soon spiraled into something far greater. Henry's calm leadership and unyielding belief in redemption would rally the unlikeliest of allies: a group of the town's defenders, former gang members seeking second chances, and townspeople ready to reclaim their dignity. Together, they would face the Iron Talons and uncover a deeper web of corruption stretching far beyond their small town. But change does not come without a price. As the stakes rise and the line between friend and foe blurs, the people of Brightvale must navigate treacherous alliances, confront their own doubts, and decide what kind of future they are willing to fight for. In this story of redemption, resilience, and justice, Brightvale's greatest battle isn't fought with fists or weapons but with hope. As the town faces its darkest hour, the question looms: can one man's belief in the possibility of change spark a transformation that ripples far beyond their borders? The journey begins in the shadow of fear, but what waits at the end may light the way for others. The morning sun cast a golden hue over the sleepy town of Brightvale. The air was crisp, the kind that promised a warm afternoon, and the streets were already bustling with the kind of quiet, purposeful energy typical of a small community. Farmers set up their stands in the town square, displaying the fruits of their labor, while shopkeepers flipped their signs to "open" and swept their stoops. At the edge of the square, Henry Fields arranged his produce with military precision. The tomatoes were plump and red, the cucumbers fresh and green, and his carrots had that unmistakable earthy sweetness that drew customers from miles around. Henry was a fixture at the farmer's market, a man of few words, but with a kind smile and a reputation for being as dependable as the sunrise. Yet, beneath the exterior of a quiet farmer, Henry carried the scars of a life few in Brightvale could imagine. Decades ago, he had been a Navy SEAL, leading a team of elite operatives on missions that never made the news. His hands, now calloused from tilling soil, had once been trained for combat. But Henry had left that life behind, seeking peace in the rhythms of the earth. Until today, the first sign of trouble was the sound. It started as a low rumble, barely perceptible over the chatter of the market. But it grew louder, a cacophony of roaring engines that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. Heads turned as a group of motorcycles came into view, their chrome gleaming in the sunlight. The Iron Talons had arrived. The gang rode into Brightvale like they owned the place, their leader, Roy Blackstone, at the head of the pack. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a predatory smirk and an aura of unshakable confidence. His leather jacket bore the gang's emblem, a menacing talon clutching a skull. The townsfolk froze. The Talons were infamous throughout the state for extortion, intimidation, and violence. They had terrorized towns like Brightvale before, draining them dry before moving on to the next target. Now, it seemed, it was Brightvale's turn. Roy dismounted his bike in front of the diner, his boots hitting the pavement with a deliberate thud. He looked around, taking in the square like a lion surveying its prey. His men fanned out, their sneers and tattoos drawing nervous glances from the townsfolk. Henry watched from his stand, his hands stilling on a basket of apples. His expression didn't change, but his eyes, sharp and calculating, took in every detail: the number of bikers, their positions, the way they moved. Old instincts stirred within him, but he kept them buried beneath his farmer's demeanor. Roy stepped into the diner, where Anna Meyer, the owner, stood frozen behind the counter. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice smooth and condescending. "Nice little place you've got here. Be a shame if anything happened to it." Anna's voice trembled as she replied, You don't want any trouble. Roy leaned against the counter, his smirk widening. Oh, I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to offer protection. For a small fee, of course. Outside, Henry moved slowly, setting down his basket of apples and wiping his hands on a cloth. He glanced at his watch, then at the market around him. The Talons were spreading out, their presence casting a shadow over the sunny morning. Roy's voice carried through the open diner door. We'll start with, let's say, $2,000 a week. Call it an introductory rate. Anna stammered, I can't afford that. Roy's smirk disappeared, replaced by a cold, hard edge. You can't afford not to. A sudden crash made everyone jump. One of the bikers had knocked over a display of fresh bread outside the bakery, sending loaves tumbling into the street. Another shoved a farmer aside, laughing as he snatched an apple from a crate. Henry watched it all without moving, his face unreadable. Roy exited the diner, satisfied. We'll be back tomorrow for your first payment, he told Anna. And don't try anything stupid. As he strode back to his bike, his eyes met Henry's. He paused, sizing up the quiet man at the produce stand. Nice setup you've got here, Roy said. Bet you do good business. Henry met his gaze evenly. Enough to get by. Roy's smirk returned. Well, don't worry. We'll make sure nothing happens to it. Henry didn't respond. He simply picked up an apple and polished it with his cloth, his movements slow and deliberate. Something about Henry's calm demeanor seemed to unsettle Roy. His smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. See you around, old man, he said, climbing onto his bike. The iron talons roared out of town, leaving behind a wake of unease. As the engines faded into the distance, the market slowly came back to life. Vendors picked up fallen goods, and customers whispered nervously among themselves. Anna stepped out of the diner, her face pale. Henry approached her, holding out a basket of apples. For the trouble, he said. Anna managed a weak smile. Thanks, Henry. He nodded and turned away, his mind already working. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Henry sat on the porch of his modest farmhouse, his phone in hand. He scrolled through his contacts until he found a name, David Hawkins. Henry hesitated for only a moment before pressing the call button. The line rang once, twice, before a familiar voice answered. Henry, been a long time. It has, Henry replied. I need your help. There was a pause on the other end. Then, what's going on? Henry looked out at the horizon, where the first stars were beginning to appear. Trouble's coming, he said, and it's bigger than I can handle alone. The quiet of Henry Field's farmhouse was deceptive. Outside, the soft chirping of crickets filled the air, and the fields of corn swayed gently in the evening breeze. Inside, however, the atmosphere was charged with tension. Henry sat at his kitchen table, a thick file folder spread out before him. Old photographs, maps, and classified mission reports lay scattered, remnants of a life he had long since left behind. The phone on the table vibrated. Henry glanced at the screen. David Hawkins. It's worse than I thought, Hawk said without preamble when Henry answered. How bad? They're organized, Hawk replied. Roy Blackstone isn't just running some backwater biker gang. The Iron Talons have connections, dirty cops, small-time politicians, even a few guys in the private security sector. He's looking to expand, and Brightvale is his foothold. Henry's jaw tightened. He could already see the signs. The Talons weren't just extorting local businesses. They were scouting, testing the waters to see how much resistance they'd face. I'll be there in 2 days, Hawk added. Don't do anything reckless until then. Reckless? Henry allowed himself a faint smile. When have I ever been reckless? Hawk laughed, a low, gravelly sound. Reckless is your middle name, old man. Henry ended the call and leaned back in his chair, staring at the photographs spread across the table. They showed him and his old SEAL team, Shadow Unit, posing in various locations. A jungle clearing, a snow-covered outpost, a sun-baked desert. These were men and women who had faced the impossible together, who had trusted each other with their lives. Henry's eyes fell on one particular photo, one that showed him with Sarah Lawson. Her sharp eyes and confident stance made her look every inch the logistics expert she had been. She had been the one to get them out of more tight spots than he could count. He picked up his phone again and dialed her number. "Henry Fields," Sarah answered, her voice tinged with surprise. "I didn't think I'd hear from you again." "Didn't think I'd have to call," Henry replied. "But things have changed." Sarah listened as he explained the situation in Brightvale. When he finished, there was a long pause. "I'm in," she said finally. "Send me everything you've got on Blackstone and the Talents. I'll start digging." Henry exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Thanks, Sarah." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "If these guys are as bad as you say, we're going to need more than just the old crew. You've got a plan, right?" Henry's silence was answer enough. The next morning, the Iron Talons returned. The sound of their motorcycles echoed through the town square, louder and more menacing than before. Roy Blackstone led the pack, his leather jacket flaring behind him as he dismounted in front of Henry's produce stand. "Morning, farmer," Roy said, his smirk firmly in place. "Got a minute?" Henry looked up from the basket of tomatoes he was arranging. "What can I do for you?" Roy sauntered closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Word around town is you're a bit of a troublemaker." "Word travels fast," Henry replied evenly. Roy's smirk faltered. For a moment, he seemed unsure how to respond to Henry's calm demeanor. Then his bravado returned. "Trouble's not good for business, old man. Maybe you should think about keeping your head down." Henry picked up a tomato and examined it closely, as though Roy weren't even there. "Brightvale's a nice town," he said. "I'd hate to see it ruined by outsiders." Roy's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Fields. You don't know who you're messing with." Henry met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Neither do you." For the briefest moment, something flickered in Roy's eyes. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He barked a laugh and turned to his men. "Let's go, boys. We'll let the farmer think about his choices." The gang mounted their bikes and roared out of the square, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a palpable sense of unease. That evening, Henry met with Sarah and Hawk at his farmhouse. Sarah had arrived with a stack of files and a laptop, while Hawk had brought a duffel bag full of equipment. "We've got a problem," Sarah said, spreading out her research on the kitchen table. "Roy Blackstone isn't just a gang leader. He's part of a larger network. They're trafficking drugs, weapons, even people. Brightvale is their next hub." Hawk leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "So what's the plan, Henry? You didn't call us here just to talk?" Henry looked at the two of them, his expression serious. "We're going to stop them, but we're not going to do it with brute force." Hawk raised an eyebrow. "Since when do you shy away from brute force?" "This isn't the battlefield," Henry said. "These aren't enemy combatants. They're criminals, sure, but they're also people who've lost their way. Some of them might even want out." Sarah nodded slowly. "You're talking about rehabilitation." "Exactly," Henry said. "We'll defend the town, but we'll do it by showing them a better way. And if we do it right, we won't just stop Roy. We'll dismantle his entire operation." Hawk whistled low. "That's ambitious, even for you." "It's the only way," Henry said firmly. Meanwhile, in a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of town, Roy paced back and forth, his frustration mounting. "Who is this guy?" he demanded, slamming a fist on the table. Jack Red, his second in command, shrugged. "Just some old farmer. Probably all talk." Roy glared at him. "You don't believe that, and neither do I. He's too calm, too confident." Jack hesitated. "What do you want to do?" Roy's smirk returned, colder than ever. "We find out who he really is. And when we do, we remind him why no one crosses the Iron Talents." Back at the farmhouse, Henry watched as Sarah and Hawk finalized their preparations. His mind raced with memories of his time in the SEALs, of the missions that had pushed him to the edge and back. He had always believed that those days were behind him. But now, as the shadows of his past crept closer, Henry knew he couldn't run from them any longer. The early morning fog still hung low over Brightvale as Henry Fields stood at the edge of his field, the damp earth cool under his boots. He watched the horizon, his thoughts as heavy as the mist. The Iron Talons weren't just a nuisance. They were the spearhead of something bigger, more dangerous. Behind him, the kitchen light flickered on. Sarah Lawson, the logistics expert who'd once been the backbone of Shadow Unit, appeared in the doorway. She carried 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "You look like you haven't slept," she said, handing Henry a cup. "Too much to think about," Henry replied. "Roy Blackstone is smarter than most gang leaders I've dealt with. He's not going to make it easy." Sarah sipped her coffee, her sharp eyes scanning the fields. "That's why we're here. What's the next move?" Henry glanced back at the house, where Hawk Hawkins was already awake, dismantling a drone on the kitchen table to modify it for surveillance. "We need more people," Henry said. "A handful of us isn't enough to counter what Roy's bringing." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Who do you have in mind?" Henry hesitated. "There's a group of guys in town. Ex-cons, mostly. I've been working with them in my spare time, teaching them skills, helping them find work. They've come a long way, but—" "You're not sure they're ready," Sarah finished for him. Henry nodded. "This is different. It's not just about turning their lives around anymore. It's about defending their town." Sarah set her mug on the fence post. "Then let's find out if they're ready." By midday, the group had gathered in Henry's barn, a weathered structure that now served as both a storage shed and an impromptu training center. The recruits were a motley crew, men and women in their 20s and 30s, each carrying the weight of past mistakes. Among them was Nate Harlan, a wiry man with sharp features who had spent 5 years in prison for armed robbery. Beside him stood Marcus Big Mac McAllister, a hulking figure with a shaved head and a surprisingly gentle demeanor. "All right," Henry began, his voice calm but commanding. "You all know why you're here. The Iron Talons are pushing into Brightvale, and they don't plan to stop until they own this town." The group shifted uncomfortably, exchanging nervous glances. "I'm not asking you to fight them," Henry continued. "I'm asking you to protect your community, to show them that Brightvale won't be intimidated." Nate crossed his arms. "With all due respect, Mr. Fields, we're not exactly SEALs. What can we do against guys like them?" Henry's gaze locked on Nate, steady and unwavering. "You've got skills they don't expect. You know these streets. You know how to think under pressure. And most importantly, you've got something they don't have, a reason to fight. This is your home." The room fell silent as Henry's words sank in. "We'll train you," Sarah added, stepping forward. "Discipline, strategy, and teamwork. You'll learn how to neutralize threats without resorting to violence." Big Mac scratched his head. "And what happens if they don't back down?" "That's where we come in," Hawk said, walking into the barn with a laptop under his arm. "We'll coordinate. Make sure you're never out of your depth. But make no mistake, you're the front line. This is your fight." The group exchanged hesitant nods. Henry leaned forward, his voice firm. "This isn't about who you've been. It's about who you want to be. If any of you want out, now's the time to say so." No one moved. "All right," Henry said. "Let's get to work." The next few days were a blur of activity. Sarah and Hawk turned the barn into a training ground, setting up obstacle courses and drills to teach the recruits coordination and situational awareness. They practiced communication, learning to rely on each other rather than acting on impulse. Henry focused on mental preparation. He drilled into the group the importance of restraint, of staying calm under pressure. "Violence isn't strength," he told them repeatedly. "Control is." Nate proved to be a quick learner, his street smarts giving him an edge in tactical thinking. Big Mac, despite his size, showed remarkable agility and an ability to predict movements during drills. "You've got potential," Henry told them during a break. "But potential means nothing without purpose. Why are you here?" "To protect Brightvale," Nate answered. "To prove we can be better," Big Mac added. Henry nodded. "Hold on to that. It'll keep you steady when things get tough." Meanwhile, Roy Blackstone was making his own preparations. At a rundown bar on the outskirts of town, he met with his inner circle, a group of hardened bikers who thrived on chaos. "This isn't going the way I planned," Roy admitted, pacing in front of them. "That old man's got something up his sleeve. I can feel it." Jack Red leaned back in his chair, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "You're overthinking it, boss. He's just a farmer." Roy's fist slammed down on the table, silencing the room. "He's not just a farmer. He's something else. Something dangerous. One of the younger bikers, a brash man named Vince, snorted. What are we supposed to do? Wait around while he plants carrots. Roy's eyes narrowed. No, we hit him where it hurts. He turned to Jack. Get me everything you can on Fields, his past, his family, his friends. I want to know what makes him tick. Back at the farm, training intensified. The recruits began to gel as a team, their confidence growing with each passing day. During one particularly grueling drill, Nate pulled Henry aside. Why are you doing this? He asked. Henry considered the question carefully. Because I've seen what happens when good people do nothing, and because I believe in second chances. Nate nodded slowly, as though the answer had confirmed something he already suspected. That evening, as the sun set over the fields, Sarah approached Henry while he was stacking hay bales. They're getting there, she said. But are you sure they'll be ready when the Talons make their move? Henry stared out at the horizon, his expression unreadable. They don't have to be perfect. They just have to believe in what they're fighting for. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Roy's men rolled into town under the cover of darkness. They didn't know it yet, but their every move was being watched. High above, a modified drone hovered silently, its camera feeding live footage back to Hawk's laptop. They're testing us, Hawk muttered. But they're about to find out this isn't the town they thought it was. Henry stood behind him, his arms crossed. Let them come, he said quietly. The real fight hasn't even started. The Iron Talons made their first aggressive move under the cover of darkness. They rolled into Brightvale's industrial district, their engines rumbling low, like predators stalking prey. The gang spread out in small groups, some heading for the diner, others toward the hardware store and grocery. From his vantage point on a rooftop, Nate Harlan watched the scene unfold. His earpiece crackled as Hawk's voice came through. They're testing the waters, Hawk said, trying to see how far they can push. Nate's hand tightened around the radio clipped to his vest. What's the play? Wait, Henry's calm voice replied. Let them think they're in control. Below, Roy Blackstone stood in the center of the square, barking orders to his men. They began banging on windows, breaking outdoor furniture, and overturning trash cans. It was an orchestrated show of force meant to spread fear, but the streets were eerily empty. Inside a nearby building, Henry, Sarah, and Big Mac watched the scene on a surveillance feed. The cameras, installed discreetly over the past week, gave them clear views of the Talons' movements. They want to bait us into a fight, Sarah said, her fingers flying across the laptop keyboard. We won't give it to them, Henry replied. Not their kind of fight, anyway. Outside, Roy grew impatient. He kicked over a planter in front of the diner, the crash echoing through the stillness. Where is everyone? He snarled. Jack Red, his second in command, shrugged. Probably hiding. Cowards. Roy's scowl deepened. Or they're planning something. In the shadows, the newly trained recruits moved into position. They weren't carrying weapons. Henry had insisted on that. But their stances were confident, their movements precise. Big Mac's voice came through the comms. We're in position on the west side. Copy that, Nate whispered. East side ready. Henry leaned into his radio. Remember, the goal is to contain, not confront. Stick to the plan. The Talons reached the first trap near the diner. As two bikers tried to break the door, the lights flickered on, and a booming voice echoed through the square. This is private property. Leave now, or law enforcement will be contacted. It was Sarah's pre-recorded message, triggered by motion sensors. The sudden noise startled the bikers, and they stumbled back. Across the square, another group of Talons found themselves caught in a similar setup. A set of floodlights blazed to life, illuminating their every move. What the? One of them muttered, shielding his eyes. That's enough, came a calm voice from the shadows. The bikers turned to see Nate and Big Mac stepping out of the darkness, flanked by two other recruits. Their hands were empty, but their presence was anything but passive. You don't belong here, Nate said, his tone steady. One of the bikers sneered. What are you gonna do about it, huh? Nothing, Big Mac replied. If you leave now. For a moment, the bikers hesitated. The calm, disciplined demeanor of the group was unsettling, their lack of fear more unnerving than any show of force. Let's go, one of them muttered. No way, another argued. They're bluffing. Nate took a single step forward. Do I look like I'm bluffing? The biker's bravado faltered, and he took an involuntary step back. Meanwhile, Roy was growing increasingly agitated. His men were reporting strange encounters, surveillance equipment, and coordinated resistance. Not the chaos he had expected. Boss, Jack said, approaching him, this place isn't normal. They're ready for us. Roy's jaw clenched. Then we push harder. He pointed to a nearby alley where two of his men were idling. Get those doors open. We're sending a message. The bikers moved toward a hardware store, crowbars in hand, but as they approached the doors, a loud siren blared, and water sprayed from overhead sprinklers. Damn it! One of them shouted, slipping on the wet pavement. Roy watched from a distance, his face a mask of frustration. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Inside the surveillance hub, Henry and Sarah monitored the chaos. They're starting to fracture, Sarah noted, pointing at the feed. Their confidence is slipping. Henry nodded. Good. But we're not done yet. He picked up his radio. Nate, Big Mac, time to show them we mean business. As the Talons regrouped near the square, Nate stepped forward into the light. Big Mac and the others followed, forming a line that blocked the gang's path. Roy strode toward them, his eyes narrowing. You think you're tough, standing there like that? We're not trying to be tough, Nate said evenly. We're protecting our town. Roy barked a laugh. You're protecting it from me? You've got no weapons, no numbers. You're nothing. Nate didn't flinch. Maybe, but we've got something you don't. Roy sneered. And what's that? Discipline, Henry's voice rang out as he stepped into view. The gang turned as one to see the farmer walking toward them, his expression calm but resolute. You see, Roy, Henry continued, your whole strategy is based on fear. But fear doesn't work on people who've faced worse than you and come out stronger. Roy's smirk faltered, and he took an involuntary step back. Henry stopped a few feet away, his eyes locking on Roy's. This is your only warning. Leave Brightvale. Now. For a moment, Roy looked like he might lash out. But the disciplined formation behind Henry, the eerie calm of the defenders, and the frustration of the night's failures were too much. We'll be back, Roy snarled, retreating to his bike. You can't stop us forever. The Talons mounted their motorcycles and roared out of town, leaving the square in a tense silence. Back in the barn, the group gathered to debrief. The tension in the air had given way to a cautious sense of accomplishment. We held them off, Big Mac said, wiping sweat from his brow. For now, Henry cautioned. But they'll come back, and next time, they'll come harder. Nate stepped forward. Then we'll be ready. Henry studied the faces of his recruits, their resolve stronger than he had seen before. He nodded. Yes, we will. In a dingy motel on the outskirts of town, Roy sat in a dimly lit room, a map of Brightvale spread out before him. They're organized, he muttered. Too organized. Jack leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. What's the plan, boss? Roy's eyes burned with determination. We break them, one way or another. The morning after the Iron Talon's retreat, Brightvale awoke to an uneasy calm. The streets were quiet, but the tension hung in the air like a storm cloud. Word of the confrontation had spread quickly, and while many townspeople felt safer knowing someone was standing up to the gang, others worried it was only a matter of time before things escalated. Henry Fields was back at his market stall, arranging rows of fresh tomatoes. His movements were deliberate, his demeanor calm, but his mind raced with plans for what was coming next. Henry, a voice called from across the square. It was Sheriff Mike Carter, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached. His broad shoulders and weathered face carried the weight of years spent protecting a small town that had suddenly become a battleground. We need to talk, Carter said. Henry gestured to the empty stool beside his stall. Pull up a seat. Carter didn't sit. He crossed his arms, glancing around to ensure no one was within earshot. You're stirring up a hornet's nest. Blackstone's not going to let this go. I know, Henry replied evenly. Do you? Carter shot back. Because I've seen what happens when people like him don't get their way. They don't just go away quietly, Henry. They come back with everything they've got. Henry's eyes met Carter's, steady and unflinching. That's why we're preparing. When they come back, we'll be ready. Carter sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. You're putting a target on this town. A lot of people don't want to be caught in the crossfire. Henry nodded. I understand that. But doing nothing isn't an option. If we let them win here, they'll just move on to the next town, and the one after that. Someone has to take a stand. Carter hesitated, then leaned in closer. I'm with you, Henry. I always have been. But not everyone feels the same way. Some folks are starting to talk about leaving. Others are less supportive. Henry's jaw tightened. Less supportive how? Carter hesitated, then lowered his voice. Roy's got people in town. Locals he's paid off, or scared into cooperating. If you're not careful, this fight could get a lot messy, eh? That afternoon, Henry gathered his team at the barn for an emergency meeting. Hawk, Sarah, Nate, Big Mac, and the rest of the recruits sat on hay bales and crates, their faces tense as they listened to Carter relay the latest developments. We've got moles, Carter said bluntly. People feeding Roy information, maybe even helping him plan his next move. I don't know who they are yet, but I'll find out. Can't we just lock them up? Big Mac asked. Carter shook his head. Not without evidence. And even if we could, that wouldn't stop Roy. He'd just find new ways to work around us. Sarah leaned forward, her sharp mind already working. Then we need to control the flow of information. If Roy has insiders, we use that to our advantage. How? Nate asked. Disinformation, Sarah replied. We feed them fake plans. Let them think they're one step ahead while we set the real trap. Hawk grinned. I like the way you think. Henry held up a hand, silencing the room. This isn't just about strategy. We're dealing with people who are scared or desperate. They've made bad choices, but that doesn't mean they're beyond saving. Saving? Nate frowned. You think we can turn them? We've done it before, Henry said, and we'll do it again. But it has to be their choice. Our job is to give them a reason to make it. Later that evening, Roy Blackstone sat in the back room of a seedy bar on the outskirts of town, surrounded by his inner circle. A map of Brightvale was spread out on the table, covered in handwritten notes and markings. We've got people on the inside, Roy said, tapping the map. They're feeding us everything we need. Carter's stretched thin, and Fields is just a farmer playing soldier. This town's ours for the taking. Jack Red nodded, but his expression was uncertain. They're more organized than we thought. That last encounter didn't go the way we expected. Roy's eyes burned with frustration. That's because we underestimated them. Not again. Next time, we hit them hard, and we make it clear who's in charge. Jack hesitated. Boss, what if some of our guys don't want to fight? A lot of them have families here. They're starting to question why we're even doing this. Roy slammed his fist on the table, making the map jump. Then you remind them who they're dealing with. They either fall in line, or they get out of the way. We won't give it to them, Henry replied. Not their kind of fight, anyway. Outside, Roy grew impatient. He kicked over a planter in front of the diner, the crash echoing through the stillness. Where is everyone? He snarled. Jack Red, his second in command, shrugged. Probably hiding. Cowards. Roy's scowl deepened. Or they're planning something. In the shadows, the newly trained recruits moved into position. They weren't carrying weapons. Henry had insisted on that. But their stances were confident, their movements precise. Big Mac's voice came through the comms. We're in position on the west side. Copy that, Nate whispered. East side ready. Henry leaned into his radio. Remember, the goal is to contain, not confront. Stick to the plan. The Talons reached the first trap near the diner. As two bikers tried to break the door, the lights flickered on, and a booming voice echoed through the square. This is private property. Leave now, or law enforcement will be contacted. It was Sarah's pre-recorded message, triggered by motion sensors. The sudden noise startled the bikers, and they stumbled back. Across the square, another group of Talons found themselves caught in a similar setup. A set of floodlights blazed to life, illuminating their every move. What the? One of them muttered, shielding his eyes. That's enough, came a calm voice from the shadows. The bikers turned to see Nate and Big Mac stepping out of the darkness, flanked by 2 other recruits. Their hands were empty, but their presence was anything but passive. "You don't belong here," Nate said, his tone steady. One of the bikers sneered. "What are you gonna do about it, huh?" "Nothing," Big Mac replied. "If you leave now." For a moment, the bikers hesitated. The calm, disciplined demeanor of the group was unsettling, their lack of fear more unnerving than any show of force. "Let's go," one of them muttered. "No way," another argued. "They're bluffing." Nate took a single step forward. "Do I look like I'm bluffing?" The biker's bravado faltered, and he took an involuntary step back. Meanwhile, Roy was growing increasingly agitated. His men were reporting strange encounters, surveillance equipment, and coordinated resistance. Not the chaos he had expected. "Boss," Jack said, approaching him, "this place isn't normal. They're ready for us." Roy's jaw clenched. "Then we push harder." He pointed to a nearby alley where 2 of his men were idling. "Get those doors open. We're sending a message." The bikers moved toward a hardware store, crowbars in hand, but as they approached the doors, a loud siren blared, and water sprayed from overhead sprinklers. "Damn it!" one of them shouted, slipping on the wet pavement. Roy watched from a distance, his face a mask of frustration. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Inside the surveillance hub, Henry and Sarah monitored the chaos. "They're starting to fracture," Sarah noted, pointing at the feed. "Their confidence is slipping." Henry nodded. "Good. But we're not done yet." He picked up his radio. "Nate, Big Mac, time to show them we mean business." As the Talons regrouped near the square, Nate stepped forward into the light. Big Mac and the others followed, forming a line that blocked the gang's path. Roy strode toward them, his eyes narrowing. "You think you're tough, standing there like that?" "We're not trying to be tough," Nate said evenly. "We're protecting our town." Roy barked a laugh. "You're protecting it from me? You've got no weapons, no numbers. You're nothing." Nate didn't flinch. "Maybe, but we've got something you don't." Roy sneered. "And what's that?" "Discipline," Henry's voice rang out as he stepped into view. The gang turned as one to see the farmer walking toward them, his expression calm but resolute. "You see, Roy," Henry continued, "your whole strategy is based on fear. But fear doesn't work on people who've faced worse than you and come out stronger." Roy's smirk faltered, and he took an involuntary step back. Henry stopped a few feet away, his eyes locking on Roy's. "This is your only warning. Leave Brightvale. Now." For a moment, Roy looked like he might lash out. But the disciplined formation behind Henry, the eerie calm of the defenders, and the frustration of the night's failures were too much. "We'll be back," Roy snarled, retreating to his bike. "You can't stop us forever." The Talons mounted their motorcycles and roared out of town, leaving the square in a tense silence. Back in the barn, the group gathered to debrief. The tension in the air had given way to a cautious sense of accomplishment. "We held them off," Big Mac said, wiping sweat from his brow. "For now," Henry cautioned. "But they'll come back, and next time, they'll come harder." Nate stepped forward. "Then we'll be ready." Henry studied the faces of his recruits, their resolve stronger than he had seen before. He nodded. "Yes, we will." In a dingy motel on the outskirts of town, Roy sat in a dimly lit room, a map of Brightvale spread out before him. "They're organized," he muttered. "Too organized." Jack leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "What's the plan, boss?" Roy's eyes burned with determination. "We break them, one way or another." The morning after the Iron Talon's retreat, Brightvale awoke to an uneasy calm. The streets were quiet, but the tension hung in the air like a storm cloud. Word of the confrontation had spread quickly, and while many townspeople felt safer knowing someone was standing up to the gang, others worried it was only a matter of time before things escalated. Henry Fields was back at his market stall, arranging rows of fresh tomatoes. His movements were deliberate, his demeanor calm, but his mind raced with plans for what was coming next. "Henry," a voice called from across the square. It was Sheriff Mike Carter, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached. His broad shoulders and weathered face carried the weight of years spent protecting a small town that had suddenly become a battleground. "We need to talk," Carter said. Henry gestured to the empty stool beside his stall. Pull up a seat. Carter didn't sit. He crossed his arms, glancing around to ensure no one was within earshot. You're stirring up a hornet's nest. Blackstone's not going to let this go. I know, Henry replied evenly. Do you? Carter shot back. Because I've seen what happens when people like him don't get their way. They don't just go away quietly, Henry. They come back with everything they've got. Henry's eyes met Carter's, steady and unflinching. That's why we're preparing. When they come back, we'll be ready. Carter sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. You're putting a target on this town. A lot of people don't want to be caught in the crossfire. Henry nodded. I understand that. But doing nothing isn't an option. If we let them win here, they'll just move on to the next town, and the one after that. Someone has to take a stand. Carter hesitated, then leaned in closer. I'm with you, Henry. I always have been. But not everyone feels the same way. Some folks are starting to talk about leaving. Others are less supportive. Henry's jaw tightened. Less supportive how? Carter hesitated, then lowered his voice. Roy's got people in town. Locals he's paid off, or scared into cooperating. If you're not careful, this fight could get a lot messy, eh? That afternoon, Henry gathered his team at the barn for an emergency meeting. Hawk, Sarah, Nate, Big Mac, and the rest of the recruits sat on hay bales and crates, their faces tense as they listened to Carter relay the latest developments. We've got moles, Carter said bluntly. People feeding Roy information, maybe even helping him plan his next move. I don't know who they are yet, but I'll find out. Can't we just lock them up? Big Mac asked. Carter shook his head. Not without evidence. And even if we could, that wouldn't stop Roy. He'd just find new ways to work around us. Sarah leaned forward, her sharp mind already working. Then we need to control the flow of information. If Roy has insiders, we use that to our advantage. How? Nate asked. Disinformation, Sarah replied. We feed them fake plans. Let them think they're one step ahead while we set the real trap. Hawk grinned. I like the way you think. Henry held up a hand, silencing the room. This isn't just about strategy. We're dealing with people who are scared or desperate. They've made bad choices, but that doesn't mean they're beyond saving. Saving? Nate frowned. You think we can turn them? We've done it before, Henry said, and we'll do it again. But it has to be their choice. Our job is to give them a reason to make it. Later that evening, Roy Blackstone sat in the back room of a seedy bar on the outskirts of town, surrounded by his inner circle. A map of Brightvale was spread out on the table, covered in handwritten notes and markings. We've got people on the inside, Roy said, tapping the map. They're feeding us everything we need. Carter's stretched thin, and Fields is just a farmer playing soldier. This town's ours for the taking. Jack Red nodded, but his expression was uncertain. They're more organized than we thought. That last encounter didn't go the way we expected. Roy's eyes burned with frustration. That's because we underestimated them. Not again. Next time, we hit them hard, and we make it clear who's in charge. Jack hesitated. Boss, what if some of our guys don't want to fight? A lot of them have families here. They're starting to question why we're even doing this. Roy slammed his fist on the table, making the map jump. Then you remind them who they're dealing with. They either fall in line, or they get out of the way. Despite the signs of chaos, the town stood unbroken. Its people were safe, and the defenders had proven their worth. At the barn, the team gathered to debrief. There was a cautious air of victory in the room, tempered by the understanding that this was only one battle in a larger war. They've scattered, Sarah reported, leaning over the surveillance monitors. But Roy's loyalists might regroup if we're not careful. Hawk, seated on an overturned crate, nodded grimly. A few of the younger ones look like they're already second-guessing their choices. Could be an opportunity to turn them around. Henry, standing by the map table, looked up. We'll reach out. They saw something different last night, something better. If we move fast, we might convince them to leave the Talons behind for good. Big Mac crossed his arms, leaning against a post. And what about Roy? He's not the type to take this loss sitting down. He's in Sheriff Carter's custody, Sarah replied. For now. But you're right. He's dangerous, even behind bars. Nate spoke up, his voice steady but uncertain. Do you think he'll ever come around? Like Jack did? Henry's gaze lingered on the group, his expression thoughtful. That depends on Roy. People can change, but they have to want it. All we can do is give them the choice. Across town, Sheriff Carter stood outside the jail, speaking to two federal agents who had arrived that morning. Dressed in suits, their sharp demeanor contrasted with the sheriff's rugged appearance. "We appreciate your cooperation, Sheriff," one of the agents said. "Roy Blackstone and his gang have been a thorn in our side for years. This could be the break we need to dismantle his entire operation." Carter nodded, but his expression was guarded. Roy's not the type to talk. If you're expecting him to roll over and give you what you need, you're going to be disappointed. The second agent smirked. "People like him always have a price. We just have to figure out what it is." Inside the jail, Roy sat in a holding cell, his hands cuffed to the table in front of him. His face was a mix of fury and frustration as he stared down the federal agents who had come to question him. "You've got nothing on me," Roy snarled. "Actually," the lead agent replied, sliding a folder across the table, "we've got quite a bit. Weapons charges, extortion, conspiracy. Shall I go on?" Roy's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "We're not here to play games, Roy," the agent continued. "You help us, and we can make some of this go away. Keep fighting, and you'll spend the rest of your life in a cell." Roy's eyes narrowed. "Help you with what?" The agent leaned forward, his tone dropping. "We want the names of your contacts. The suppliers, the enforcers, anyone tied to your operation." Roy smirked bitterly. "You think I'd sell out my own people?" The agent's expression didn't waver. "We think you're a man who values power. And right now, you don't have any. Help us, and maybe you get some of it back." Roy leaned back in his chair, his smirk fading. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. Back at the barn, Henry and his team discussed the next steps. "Word's spreading," Sarah said, looking up from her laptop. "Other towns are reaching out. They want to know how we did it." Nate raised an eyebrow. "You mean how we stopped a gang without firing a single bullet?" "Exactly," Sarah replied. "It's not just about what we did. It's about what it represents. People are starting to believe that change is possible." Henry nodded. "That's good. But it also makes us a target. If Roy's network realizes what we're doing, they'll come after us harder than ever." "So what do we do?" Big Mac asked. "We expand," Henry said simply. "We take what we've built here and use it to help others. But we have to be smart about it. Every step we take has to be calculated." Hawk grinned. "You mean like everything we've done so far?" Henry chuckled. "Exactly." That evening, Henry visited the town square, where a group of volunteers was cleaning up the aftermath of the Talon's attack. Broken windows were being boarded up, and debris was being swept away. Grace, the diner owner, spotted Henry and waved him over. "You look like you've had a long day," she said, handing him a cup of coffee. "They're all long days now," Henry replied with a small smile. Grace leaned against the counter, her expression thoughtful. "You've done something incredible here, Henry. People feel safe again. They feel like they have a future." Henry nodded, his gaze sweeping over the square. "It's not just me. It's all of us. This town stood together when it mattered most." "And now?" Grace asked. Henry took a sip of his coffee, his expression distant. "Now we make sure it lasts." In the shadows of a nearby alley, one of Roy's former associates watched the scene unfold. He had been part of the group that fled during the confrontation, and now he was torn. The gang had been his family, his purpose, but what he saw in Brightvale was something he'd never known. Hope. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. When the call connected, he said, "I want out. I don't care what it takes. I want out." As the night deepened, Henry returned to the barn, where Sarah and Hawk were finalizing plans for outreach to other towns. "We've got 3 solid leads," Sarah said, pointing to a map. "All small towns dealing with gang activity. If we can replicate what we've done here, we could make a real difference." Henry studied the map, his expression serious. "This isn't just about stopping gangs. It's about changing the way people think about justice, about redemption." Hawk nodded. "And about showing people that even the worst situations can turn around if you give them a reason to believe." Henry placed a hand on Hawk's shoulder. Exactly. And we're just getting started. Meanwhile, in his cell, Roy sat alone, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. For the first time, he felt something he couldn't shake, doubt. Across from him, the folder of evidence sat unopened, a reminder of the walls closing in around him. As the cell door clanged shut for the night, Roy leaned back against the cold steel and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in years, he began to wonder if Henry Fields had been right all along. Brightvale basked in an unexpected quiet, a reprieve earned but fragile. The Iron Talons had retreated, Roy Blackstone was in custody, and the townspeople were beginning to feel the weight of hope replacing fear. But the defenders of the town knew this was no time to rest. In the barn, Henry Fields stood at the map table, joined by Sarah, Hawk, Nate, and Big Mac. The hum of a new energy filled the room as they planned their next steps. "We've had inquiries from 3 towns," Sarah began, pointing at the locations marked on the map: Newton Creek, Hollow Ridge, and Westport. "They're asking for guidance, resources, anything we can spare." Nate frowned. "We barely have enough for ourselves. How are we supposed to help anyone else?" Henry leaned forward, his voice steady. "We don't give them what we don't have. We show them how to build it for themselves. What we've done here can work anywhere. They just need the tools and the mindset." Hawk nodded. "A blueprint, not a handout." "Exactly," Henry replied. "We'll share what we've learned and help them get started. But it has to come from within their communities, or it won't last." Big Mac crossed his arms. "And what about Roy's loyalists? You think they're gonna let us spread this without a fight?" "They might try to stop us," Henry admitted. "But every time they push back, it only proves why we're doing this. We're not just changing Brightvale. We're changing the rules." Meanwhile, in the county jail, Roy Blackstone sat across from a federal agent who was trying to break through his silence. "We've offered you a deal, Roy," the agent said, leaning forward. "Give us what we need, and we'll make sure you don't rot in here for the rest of your life." Roy stared at the agent, his jaw clenched. He'd always prided himself on his ability to outthink and outlast anyone who challenged him. But this time, he was facing something he couldn't control. "You think I'm scared of prison?" Roy sneered. "You think I'm scared of losing everything I built?" The agent's expression didn't change. "I think you're scared of becoming irrelevant. The world's moving on without you, Roy. Your men are either walking away or turning on you. The only way you stay in this game is by cooperating." Roy leaned back, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You think I want to stay in the game? This game's rigged, and you know it." "Then help us change it," the agent pressed. For a moment, something flickered in Roy's eyes: doubt, regret, maybe even curiosity. But he shoved it down and folded his arms. "You're wasting your time." Back in Brightvale, Sheriff Carter arrived at the barn with an update. "Got a visitor in town," Carter said, his tone cautious. "One of Roy's former lieutenants. Claims he wants out and that he's willing to talk." Henry's brow furrowed. "You think he's legit?" "Hard to say," Carter replied. "But if he's serious, this could be a game changer." They met the man, a wiry figure named Danny Ford, at the sheriff's office. Danny looked nervous, his hands fidgeting as he spoke. "I'm done," Danny said. "Roy's a sinking ship, and I'm not going down with him. I'll tell you everything I know, but I need protection. Roy's still got people out there, and they won't take kindly to me flipping." Henry studied Danny carefully. "Why now? What changed?" Danny hesitated, then shrugged. "I saw what you did. How you handled things without turning this place into a war zone. I didn't think it was possible, but you proved me wrong." Henry exchanged a glance with Carter, then nodded. "We'll protect you, but you're going to have to earn our trust. No lies, no games. Understood?" "Understood," Danny said quickly. That evening, Henry gathered the team at Grace's diner to discuss the new development. The place had become the unofficial headquarters for their efforts, its warm lighting and familiar smells offering a sense of normalcy amid the chaos. "Danny could be a turning point," Sarah said, scrolling through notes on her laptop. "If his intel checks out, we could shut down more of Roy's operation and cut off his resources." "And if he's lying?" Nate asked. "Then we deal with it," Henry said. "But I don't think he is. He's scared, and scared people don't take risks like this unless they're desperate. Big Mac leaned back in his chair. Still feels like walking a tightrope. One wrong move, and this whole thing could blow up in our faces. That's why we stay focused, Henry said. We're not just fighting Roy or his gang. We're building something better. And every time we succeed, we take another step toward making this permanent. As night fell, Danny sat in a secure room at the sheriff's office, going over maps and documents with Sarah and Hawk. He pointed to a location on the map, a warehouse on the edge of town. That's where Roy stashed most of the heavy stuff, Danny said. Guns, cash, anything he didn't want the feds to find. Sarah raised an eyebrow. And you're just now telling us this? Danny shrugged. Didn't think it mattered before. But now? Now I want out. Hawk studied Danny closely. You sure about this? Once we act on this intel, there's no going back. Danny nodded. I'm sure. I'm done with that life. The next morning, Henry, Sarah, and Carter led a raid on the warehouse, using Danny's intel to pinpoint the exact locations of the hidden caches. The operation was quick and efficient, with the defenders securing the area before anyone could sound the alarm. Inside, they found everything Danny had promised, and more. This is enough to put Roy away for good, Carter said, holding up a ledger filled with incriminating details about the gang's operations. Sarah snapped photos of the evidence, her expression grim, and enough to make us an even bigger target. Henry nodded. Then we make sure they know we're not backing down. Word of the raid spread quickly, and Brightvale's defenders braced for retaliation. But instead of an immediate attack, they received an unexpected response. 2 more of Roy's former associates showed up at the sheriff's office, each with similar stories to Danny's. They wanted out, and they were willing to help. Henry met with them personally, his calm demeanor putting them at ease. You've seen what we're building here, he said. This isn't just about taking down Roy. It's about proving there's a better way. Are you ready to be part of that? Both men nodded, their expressions filled with cautious hope. That night, as Brightvale settled into an uneasy calm, Henry stood on his porch, gazing out at the darkened fields. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of something stronger than determination. Momentum. Sarah joined him, her arms crossed against the cool night air. Think we're ready for what's coming next? We don't have a choice, Henry said. Every step we take, every person we help, it gets harder for them to stop us. Sarah smiled faintly. You sound like a man with a plan. Henry's gaze didn't waver. Not just a plan. A purpose. The sun rose over Brightvale, but the town's defenders knew the peace was tenuous. The raid on the warehouse had sent shockwaves through the remnants of Roy Blackstone's network. What was left of the Iron Talons was cornered, desperate, and unpredictable. At the barn, Henry Fields and his team gathered for a strategy meeting. A large map of the region was spread out on the table, dotted with markers indicating known gang activities, potential safe houses, and routes where reinforcements could arrive. We've cut off their resources, Sarah began, pointing to several crossed-out locations on the map. The warehouse raid was the last major stash they had. Without those weapons and funds, they're running on fumes. They're still dangerous, Hawk cautioned. Cornered animals are the most unpredictable. Big Mac, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. We've heard this before. What makes this time different? Henry straightened, his expression resolute. Because this time, we're taking the fight to them, but not on their terms. The room fell silent as Henry continued. Roy's loyalists are gathering in the neighboring town of Hollow Ridge. They're planning one final push, and they're betting everything on it. What they don't know is we've been preparing for this. Later that morning, Sheriff Carter arrived with urgent news. We've intercepted a message from Roy, Carter said, holding up a handwritten note. He's organizing a strike on Brightvale. He's calling it the Redemption Run, trying to frame it as a last stand for his gang. Henry took the note, scanning its contents. He's framing it as loyalty, he murmured. But it's desperation. Carter nodded. The timing works in our favor. Federal agents are ready to move, but they need him and his lieutenants in one place to make the arrests stick. So we let him come to us, Sarah said, catching on. Henry shook his head. No, we draw him out on neutral ground. If the fight reaches Brightvale, we risk everything we've built here. Nate frowned. Neutral ground? Where? Hawk grinned. Hollow Ridge. Roy thinks he's safe there. Let's prove him wrong. The plan came together quickly. Using intel from Danny Ford and the other defectors, the team mapped out Hollow Ridge and identified key locations where the gang might gather. The strategy wasn't to confront Roy directly, but to lure him into a scenario he couldn't control. Danny, who had become an unlikely ally, volunteered to deliver a message to Roy. He still trusts me, Danny said. If I tell him there's a deal to be made, he'll show up. Henry studied Danny carefully. You're putting yourself at risk. Are you sure about this? Danny nodded. It's time I make up for the damage I've done. If this helps bring him down, it's worth it. That evening, Danny approached the gang's hideout in Hollow Ridge. The air was thick with tension as he walked into the dimly lit bar where Roy and his remaining loyalists had gathered. Roy sat at a corner table, flanked by two enforcers. His eyes narrowed as Danny approached. You've got some nerve showing your face here, Roy growled. I've got information you need, Danny replied, keeping his voice steady. Brightvale's setting a trap for you. They think they've got you cornered. Roy leaned forward, his interest piqued. What kind of trap? Danny hesitated, then lowered his voice. They're moving their operation to an abandoned mill outside town. If you hit them there, you can take out their whole leadership in one move. Roy's eyes gleamed with a mixture of suspicion and greed. And why should I trust you? Danny met Roy's gaze. Because I'm as tired of Henry Fields as you are. I want to see him fall just as much as you do. For a moment, Roy said nothing, then he gave a slow nod. If you're lying, Ford, I'll make sure you regret it. Danny held his ground. I'm not. Back in Brightvale, Henry and his team prepared for the confrontation. The abandoned mill was chosen carefully. Not only was it isolated, but it also offered defensible positions and ample surveillance opportunities. Everything's in place, Sarah reported as she checked the feeds from hidden cameras around the mill. We'll know the moment they arrive. Big Mac stood near the entrance, his arms crossed. This is a gamble, Henry. If Roy doesn't take the bait, he'll take it, Henry interrupted. He doesn't know how to resist an opportunity to regain control. This is his last chance to prove himself, and he won't back down. Hawk nodded. And when he shows up, we'll be ready. At midnight, the sound of motorcycles echoed through the valley. Roy and his gang arrived at the mill, their headlights cutting through the darkness like predatory eyes. From a concealed position, Sarah whispered into her radio. They're here. All units, hold positions. Roy dismounted his bike, his boots crunching on the gravel. He gestured for his men to spread out, their weapons at the ready. This is it, Roy called out, his voice echoing in the night. You want me, Fields? Come and get me. From the shadows, Henry stepped into the dim light, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Roy, he said calmly, it doesn't have to end this way. Roy's face twisted in fury. Don't you dare lecture me, Fields. You took everything from me. Henry shook his head. You did that to yourself. I didn't turn your men against you. You did that by leading them down the wrong path. Roy drew his gun, leveling it at Henry. I've had enough of your sermons. This ends now. Before Roy could pull the trigger, a spotlight snapped on, illuminating the entire area. Hidden defenders emerged from the shadows, surrounding Roy and his men. Drop your weapons. Sheriff Carter's voice boomed as federal agents stepped forward, their badges gleaming in the light. You're surrounded. There's nowhere to run. Roy's men hesitated, their resolve crumbling as they realized the scope of the trap. One by one, they dropped their weapons and raised their hands. But Roy refused to surrender. You think you've won? He spat, backing toward his bike. This isn't over. Before he could escape, Hawk stepped forward, blocking his path. It is over, Roy, Hawk said. You just don't see it yet. Roy lunged, but Hawk moved with practiced precision, disarming him in a single motion. The gun clattered to the ground, and Roy fell to his knees, his fury giving way to exhaustion. As the federal agents processed the arrests, Henry stood with Carter and Sarah, watching the scene unfold. It's done, Carter said. No, Henry replied. It's just beginning. The night ended with Brightvale's defenders returning home, weary but victorious. For the first time, They felt the weight of their mission shifting. They weren't just defending their town anymore. They were building something that could change lives far beyond their borders. And as Henry stood on his porch, watching the first light of dawn creep over the horizon, he knew one thing for certain. The seeds of change had taken root. The sun rose over Brightvale, casting a golden glow across the town that had become a symbol of resilience and redemption. The events of the previous night were still fresh in everyone's minds. The capture of Roy Blackstone and the final dismantling of the Iron Talons marked the end of a dark era. But as the town stirred to life, it became clear that this was more than just a victory. It was the beginning of something greater. At the barn, Henry Field stood in front of his team. The weight of the past months etched on his face, but tempered by the quiet satisfaction of a mission accomplished. Sarah, Hawk, Big Mac, Nate, and Sheriff Carter gathered around him, their expressions a mix of relief and anticipation. "We did what we set out to do," Henry began, his voice steady. "We defended this town and showed people that change is possible. But we all know this is just the start." Sarah nodded, holding a file filled with reports from federal agents. The raid on the mill didn't just end Roy's operation. It exposed a network of corruption and crime that stretches far beyond Brightvale. "The feds are already moving on the leads we provided." "Good," Hawk said, leaning against the wall. "Let them deal with the big fish. We've got our own work to do." Henry smiled faintly. "Exactly. Brightvale is proof that even the hardest battles can be won without becoming what you're fighting against. Now, it's time to take that proof and turn it into something bigger." Later that morning, the town square was abuzz with activity as residents worked together to restore what had been damaged during the confrontation with the Iron Talons. Broken windows were replaced, storefronts were repainted, and the debris from the raid was cleared away. Grace's Diner, now a beacon of hope for the community, was the heart of the activity. Inside, Grace poured coffee and served hot meals to volunteers, her warm smile a steady presence amid the bustle. When Henry walked in, she handed him a steaming cup without a word. "You look like you could use this," she said with a smirk. "Always," Henry replied, taking a grateful sip. Grace leaned against the counter, her gaze sweeping over the room. "You've done something incredible here, Henry. This town feels alive again." "It wasn't just me," Henry said. "It was all of us. And it's not over." Grace tilted her head, curious. "What's next?" Henry's eyes sparkled with determination. "We take what we've built here and help others do the same. Brightvale isn't just a town anymore. It's a blueprint." By midday, representatives from neighboring towns began arriving in Brightvale. They had heard about the defeat of the Iron Talons and wanted to see for themselves how a small community had stood up to such a formidable threat. Sarah and Hawk led them through a presentation at the barn, detailing the strategies and principles that had guided their efforts. "This isn't about force," Sarah explained, pointing to a diagram on a whiteboard. "It's about purpose. The people we worked with didn't need punishment. They needed a reason to believe they could be something more than what they were." One of the visitors, a woman named Evelyn from the nearby town of Hollow Ridge, raised her hand. "But how do you get people to believe in that, especially after everything they've done?" Hawk stepped forward, his tone firm. "You show them. You live it. People don't change because you tell them to. They change because they see it's possible." As the day turned to evening, Sheriff Carter gathered the townspeople for a meeting in the square. The federal agents who had been involved in the operation joined them, offering an update on the broader implications of Brightvale's success. "Roy Blackstone is done," one of the agents announced. "And thanks to the intel you provided, we're dismantling the rest of his network. This town made a difference, not just for yourselves, but for people across the region." The crowd erupted in applause, their pride and relief palpable. When the noise subsided, Henry stepped forward. He scanned the faces of his friends and neighbors, each one a testament to the strength of community. "This isn't just a victory," Henry said, his voice carrying across the square. "It's a promise that no matter how dark things seem, there's always a way forward. We proved that here, and now it's time to share that with others." As the celebration unfolded, Danny Ford sat quietly on a bench near the edge of the square. He had been instrumental in bringing down Roy, but he still wrestled with his past and what it meant to truly start over. Henry noticed him and walked over, taking a seat beside him. "You've done a lot to make this happen, Danny," Henry said. "You should be proud." Danny shrugged, staring at the ground. "It doesn't erase what I've done." "No," Henry agreed, "but it's a start. And what you do next will matter even more." Danny looked up, his expression a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "You really think I can change?" Henry nodded. "I don't just think it, I know it, because I've seen it happen." As the night deepened, the town square transformed into a celebration of unity and hope. Music played, families danced, and laughter filled the air. For the first time in years, Brightvale felt whole. Standing on the steps of Grace's diner, Henry watched the scene with quiet pride. Sarah joined him, holding a plate of food. "You've got that look again," she said, handing him the plate. "What look?" Henry asked, raising an eyebrow. "The one that says you're already planning your next move," Sarah teased. Henry chuckled. "Can't help it. There's too much to do." "Well, whatever it is, we're with you," Sarah said, her voice steady. Henry looked at her, then out at the crowd. "This is just the beginning." Brightvale showed the world what's possible. Now, it's up to us to make sure that light keeps spreading. As the celebration wound down, Henry walked the quiet streets of Brightvale one last time. The town that had once been defined by fear and division now stood as a beacon of hope. And while the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. Brightvale was ready to face whatever came next. With the moon casting a gentle glow over the town, Henry stood on his porch, sipping a final cup of coffee. Grace had joined him, the two of them sharing a comfortable silence. "You really think this will last?" Grace asked softly. "It will," Henry said with quiet conviction, "because it's not just about this town. It's about what we've started, and the world needs it now more than ever." As the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, Brightvale stood as proof that even in the darkest times, change was possible. And with that, the small town that had once been a target of destruction became a symbol of redemption and the unbreakable strength of the human spirit.